Hello everyone, welcome to Malleus Gaming. I'm your host Malleus, and today in Total Tactics, we're going to be taking a deep dive into one of my favorite infantry formations, the ever-classic and ever-reliable Checkerboard Formation. This formation is quite powerful and can be effectively used by any of the factions within Total War Warhammer 3. I'll be covering the strengths, the weaknesses, and the various applications of this formation so that you can make the most out of it in your campaigns. This video will be primarily for newer players, but I'm hoping you veterans will be able to get something out of it as well. Now, if that all sounds good to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below to help out the channel. Alrighty then, time to set the board and get these pieces moving. The typical and likely the most commonly used formation that Total War encourages new players to use is the standard double line, where melee units are placed in a solid line in front of the ranged units. This does the job of protecting your ranged infantry from the enemy, while also allowing them to shoot as the enemy approaches. However, this is only the case for ranged units which shoot in an arc, like archers or crossbowmen. For units which shoot in a straight line, such as gunpowder units, they will need a clear, unobstructed field of fire in order to use their weapons. Even standard bow or crossbow units are negatively affected by having their sight lines blocked, as while they can still shoot, by arcing their shots up and over the front line, you'll find that their accuracy and therefore their damage is greatly diminished. You can get around this by placing your missile units in front of your melee units, or by placing them on an elevated position behind your front line, such as a hill. However, placing your missiles in front can leave them vulnerable to enemy assaults, and retreating them back behind your melee troops can ruin the integrity of your lines as they slowly push through each other. Also, you won't always have an elevated position from which your missiles can comfortably shoot from, so using that type of terrain to make the most out of your army is not something that can be relied upon. This is where the checkerboard formation comes into play. At its core, I'd argue that the most basic principle behind the checkerboard is that it allows your units to stay out of each other's way. This is due to each unit being spaced apart from its neighboring unit, and each line within the formation being offset from the one in front of it. When properly set up, you will be able to have a melee front line to block the enemy's battle line from reaching your ranged units, who in turn will be able to shoot effectively at both long and short range thanks to having unobscured fields of view through the gaps in the front line. Additionally, while it may seem counterintuitive due to them having to stay in formation, the individual units within the checkerboard will be able to maneuver somewhat decently. If you deploy your ranged units in front, they can easily fall back behind your melee troops by moving between the gaps in the line. This simple spacing allows your units to fight unhindered, yet still benefit from each other's mutual support. In order to deploy your army in a checkerboard formation, you will first have to go to your options. Click Game Settings, and then under Battle Interface, disable Default Dragout Formation. When this is enabled, it automatically places any units you have selected and dragged out into a basic double line, so by turning it off, you are now free to position your units as you see fit. While you're here, turn off Auto Skirmish as well. When you're deploying your army, first press and hold left control, and then click on your units, alternating between melee and ranged. This will determine the order in which each unit stands in the line. Once you've selected your units, you can let go of the control key, and right-click drag the units into a line. If you don't hold control when selecting your units, they will instead be positioned in the order that their unit cards are in, from left to right, when you drag them out. When dragging out the units, you will want to keep them in fairly compact square formations. This is to ensure that the gaps in the formation won't be large enough for enemy units to move through. Now that your line is drawn out, press and hold left control again, and then double left click one of your range unit's portrait cards. This will select all of the units of that type. Now hold down left Alt, and then hold the left mouse button in order to drag the selected units into position while letting them keep their shape. You can add more lines if you wish, increasing the depth of the checkerboard, such as by adding a third line of archers, shoot over the gunpowder units, or some artillery. Lastly, deploy your cavalry or other flanking units to the wings of the formation, and then select all with Ctrl A before locking everything in place with Ctrl G. This will keep your units together in formation as you move your army around. Put your range units on guard mode so they don't chase anything, and you're good to go. The checkerboard has enough strengths to allow it to be effectively used in most situations, but it does have a few weaknesses to keep in mind. Regarding its strengths, let's discuss the shape of the individual units first. Deploying your units in compact square shapes makes them inherently more defensive, as less models will be in contact with the enemy, whose units will likely have a wider frontage. This lets your units hold their position in combat for longer, as they will be taking less damage. This should help your range units as well when they're in guard mode, as the models in the rear ranks can shoot whatever is engaging them. Another advantage of the square is that it allows your units to turn more quickly as compared to if they had a wider frontage. This is great for when you have enemy flankers coming in on your sides, as you can quickly turn your back line range units to target them. Now, as for the formation as a whole, its layered nature allows you to make the most out of range units of all types, but also certain melee units. The most obvious benefit is that your range units can shoot through the gaps as the enemy approaches, but once the lines collide, the enemy units should start wrapping around your frontline units. This will allow your range units to fire into what are effectively now the flanks of the enemy units. This can be incredibly deadly for your opponent, especially if you utilize short-ranged but high-damage units like flamethrowers or blunderbusses. These units can be difficult to use due to their short range, but by putting them in the second line behind your melee troops, they can make full use of their specialist weapons. By adding more layers with longer range weapons, your ranged damage output won't be reduced significantly, and your opponent will be forced to march right up to your powerful close-range fighters. Don't think you are limited to just ranged units for the back lines, however. Having a strong front line of defensive infantry to hold the line provides you a great opportunity to make use of shock infantry. While the defensive nature of the checkerboard does lend itself to having a more ranged focus, more melee-oriented factions can still take advantage of it. For instance, a Demons of Chaos player could have a front line of Plague Bearers to hold the enemy in place, and then a second line of Bloodletters to countercharge through the gaps. Add a third line of Pink Horrors for some literal covering fire, and some Seekers of Slaanesh for flanking purposes, and boy will your opponent be in for a world of hurt. As for weaknesses, there are some things you'll need to be careful of. First, the compact square shapes of the individual units we discussed earlier does leave them vulnerable to area of effect attacks like artillery or magic. You will need a plan to deal with these types of units, be it fast assassination units like cavalry or counter-artillery fire. Secondly, the checkerboard can be vulnerable to flanking. While your rear lines can turn quickly to keep enemy flankers in their sights, those units situated in the middle of the line have limited firing lanes, as they can only see between the units in front of them. If they turn to the side, they will be blocked by the units next to them, even with the spacing. Adding more layers to have a deeper checkerboard can help mitigate this, but then you risk reducing your forward-facing firepower too much, depending on your army composition. Thirdly, while the formation is defensively powerful to its front, a strong enough unit penetrating your front line can be devastating and cause the whole formation to collapse. This can be offset by once again adding extra layers and utilizing a defense-in-depth strategy with alternating melee and ranged lines, but still risks lowering your damage output significantly. In this last part of the video, I'll be going over two variants of the standard checkerboard formation. I've touched upon them already, the first being the melee checkerboard, and the second, the checkerboard wedge. These variants lean more into offensive and defensive tactics, respectively. The melee checkerboard is good for armies with strong defensive and shock infantry, such as the Vampire Counts or Nurgle factions. It is arranged much like a typical checkerboard, except your two lines are defensive infantry in front and shock infantry behind. This variant is based on the idea of absorbing the force behind an enemy attack and then counterpunching with your own infantry assault. The defensive infantry should have some form of charge defense, ideally charge defense against all, and the shock infantry should have great weapons for armor piercing or some form of flanking bonus. I would use this melee variant against hyper-aggressive melee armies such as Khornate factions or cavalry-heavy factions like Bretonnia. Just remember to guard your flanks, absorb their charge, and then knock them out. The second variant, the checkerboard wedge, is good for armies with strong defensive infantry and a heavy range focus, particularly when outnumbered. I've had a lot of success using this style of the formation as Kislev against hordes of Norscan marauders, particularly in the early game. It is arranged as seen here, with your heavily armored infantry at the front and some gunpowder units forming a second line behind them, then having two echelons of defensive infantry on either side of the formation, with archers forming the core inside. This variant is well protected from flankers, and the enemy line tends to either spread out against your army, allowing your front units to punch through, or they clump up on your front line, letting you bombard them with missiles and spells. Make sure your front is strong though, as they will be hit hard. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive on the checkerboard formation. It's definitely one of my favorite formations to use due to how easy it is to set up and its effectiveness in battle. While this was done primarily for campaign, I also have had success using it in multiplayer against other players. Let me know if there is anything important you think I missed, or if there was any information I covered that was new or surprised you. Also, let me know if there are any variations of this that you've come up with, as I'd love to learn about them too. And with that, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to help me through the warp tides of YouTube. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!